Okay, hello everybody. We are Paola and Gabriela from SE in English. In today's chat, we will come back to the issue of representation, LGBTQ+ representation, that we started with Dr. Gray and Dr. Pais, and this time with Tyson Seburn, whom I will introduce now. Tyson is an English as a medium of instruction lecturer and assistant academic director of an English for Academic Purposes foundation year in the International Programs Department at New College, University of Toronto. Tyson also tutors on Oxford, TEFL, Barcelona's Trinity Diploma TESOL program and coordinates the TEFL Teacher Development Day. He also does design work for education on the side. His main interests are public spaces for exploring teacher identity and development and critical and inclusive pedagogies. In 2010, Tyson created 𝘱𝘰𝘮, which is an ELT project, including a blog, a website, and a Facebook page with written and curated content by Tyson. It includes an ELT events calendar, commentary on our profession, and shared resources. Tyson says that ever since he finished kindergarten, he knew he wanted to teach. And since his career started in 1998, he has moved from the classroom to management to a mixture of both. So thank you very much for being here with us and for accepting our invitation.
I'm very happy to be here, and you know, what I've said before, I mean, how we sort of just accidentally met online. I've been very impressed with the amount of enthusiasm that you show online for these topics, and your ability to engage so many people that I admire in interviews as well. So thank you.
No, thank you, really. Thank you for accepting the invitation, as Paul said. Okay, let's begin with the questions, right? The first one has to do with teacher identity, and in one of your blog posts, you reflect upon your own teacher identity, right? And this issue is not generally dealt with in depth here in Argentina in teacher education programs, right? Is it important to deal with this in initial teacher education? Is it useful to be conscious of our professional identities? And how would this, being aware or not of our teacher identity, affect our practices?
That's a great question, and it's something that there's no easy answer for. I mean, the fact that you reflect on a teacher identity to begin with suggests that there's a lot of question marks that you have about teacher identity. And so I don't know necessarily that initial teacher training programs are, in fact, where you need to spend a lot of time talking about teacher identity. But I do think as you progress through your profession, it's always important to take a look at how you feel about yourself as a teacher, what you really feel are important issues to you as a teacher, and how you can merge sort of those things together. I mean, there's one of the reasons why I started to really think about it myself was because when I moved into the university teaching context from private language schools, which I had spent a long time teaching English at, I felt a bit deficient, actually. Like I didn't really belong in the university EAP teaching context. And I don't think that that's an uncommon feeling for some teachers, because the way in which English language teaching is positioned in many contexts, I'm not sure about Argentina, but the way it's positioned in many contexts that I've been familiar with is sort of a little bit on the remedial side. Like they're not real teachers. We're not real teachers like the public education school teachers are, or we're not real professors like university professors are. And sometimes the way that translates to a teacher themselves is to feel as though they are on the periphery of mainstream education, or they're on the periphery of content learning at university and stuff like that. And so we're sort of helping students to sort of go where they want to go, not where they currently are. And valuing the English language learning that they're actually doing for us. And so when we have that identity ourselves, partially because that's how we feel about ourselves, you know, we didn't get PhDs necessarily, as I said, I haven't. And we didn't go into English language teaching always out of a career choice. It sometimes just happened. Not to mention then the positionality of the way English language teaching is viewed by the university at large and so on. Those things can contribute to feeling inadequate, I think, and feeling as though we don't belong in the university and we don't learn more about the university structures and things like that. And so I myself felt that, and I felt I needed to really become more engaged with everything that was happening outside of just my English language teaching bubble in order to improve the way that I was able to teach. And I think I did that. And not to belabor this point at all, but you know, it wasn't really until my late 30s that I started to really consider my LGBTQ-ness as an important aspect of my teacher identity. Because up until that point, it had been really something to not hide exactly, but something to not focus on, I think. And I was sort of encouraged when I taught in Korea not to reveal that side, and you know, students wouldn't feel good about that and so on. But the older I've gotten, the more I've started to realize that actually it's part of my identity, and I have a responsibility as a mature, you know, gay man to actually be a role model and help my students who may be feeling sort of similar feelings that I did when I was younger. So.
Okay, that's very, very interesting. The way we see it, teacher identity is key, right? And another topic, another concept that we think is key, fundamental, is representation, right? In most of our chats, and we ask our guests about representation because, as I said before, for us, it is fundamental. So let's focus on representations of the LGBTQIA2 community, right?
Yeah.
In one of your publications, you claim that as a result of some research that you have carried out, you've seen that this representation usually falls into 3 different distinct categories, right? Mm-hmm. Can you tell us which these categories are, and maybe tell us a bit about them?
Sure. Yeah, sure. I mean, I certainly wasn't the first person to do this type of research, and it certainly wasn't formal research. It was more experiential, and taking a look at course books and the materials that I've been using, as well as colleagues of mine over the last couple of decades. And so Scott Thornbury really was one of the first people, I think, to actually note this. But I expanded on it insofar as what I found was that LGBTQ, or whichever acronym you want to use, the narratives in course books and the materials really tend to be either completely absent, so there are just none at all. It's certainly not any that are clearly visible. So that's sort of one category. And I think that's actually one of the biggest categories. The second would be that we're all marginalized into sort of one unit. That I think is changing a little bit now, but maybe in the 90s and the early 2000s, it was becoming more common to have a unit on LGBTQ, or like a unit on gay marriage, for example. And then finally, there are other instances where there are gay and lesbian characters, and but they're not explicitly said to be gay and lesbian characters. You know, we know sort of they are in the background, but they're typically, you know, very straight looking. They're very clean cut. They don't have exactly clear cut, visible queer characteristics. And I'm not saying that everybody does, but certainly you can have 2 women sort of shopping together and you're not totally sure. It's kind of ambiguous a little bit. Or perhaps even if it's not ambiguous, the men who are gay are probably very handsome, and very young and quite wealthy, you know, things that are very basically heteronormative in terms of the way that they're portrayed. So that's more or less the way things have been sitting for quite some time.
Yes, very Ricky Martin-like, right?
Yes, yes.
Yes.
I mean, you sort of default to that when you're making materials too, you know, like it's just an honest mistake in some regards, because, you know, even if you want to represent, and that is a goal of yours as a materials writer, sometimes you want to do so in a way that you're going to sneak it past the publisher. Other times you want to do it in a way that, you know, is going to be the least offensive to the widest group of people. And so whoever that wide group of people is, you're sort of imagining that, you know, a young, handsome, rich sort of person is probably the kind that would go off the best, you know, and most people would accept. So.
Okay, you know, it happens here in Argentina that we do not always have the opportunity to use the material we create, if we create material, but rather we sometimes have to use textbooks or course books that somebody else, maybe the principal of the language school where we work, has chosen, okay? Mm-hmm. So in that case, when we have no other option but to use that course book, which, well, as you said before, is not inclusive, is not diverse, doesn't show society as it is, how can we make our lessons more inclusive and representative, but at the same time avoid tokenism?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I honestly think no matter what you do or what you try, there needs to be training involved. So ideally you would want to have you know, institutional support for this initiative, you know, like, you know, in an ideal world, even though course books exist and you need to take them and you need to use them and they may not be perfect, it would be the best case scenario if your DOS or your, you know, manager or whatever actually wanted you to be inclusive and adapt the materials, and then helped provide training to do that. Because obviously there's going to be, you know, missteps that everybody takes when they're inadequately trained. Having said that, I realize that that's not normally the case. And we do, in fact, have to take things in our own hands as teachers. And so one way that I like to supplement this type of course book situation is to have the students try to figure out who is missing, for example, from a particular scenario. Who isn't represented? Do they see themselves in these course book materials even? Because no matter whether you identify as queer or indigenous or Black or what have you, the course book materials tend to disregard all sorts of people, not just queer people. And so I doubt that all of our students really identify with the characters, or at least many of the characters that are in these course book situations. And they can be very aspirational, and we're not very realistic. And so no matter what the scenario, we can have students try to question the course book content and question what is there, what's not there, why choices have been made by the publishers or the writers, for example, is another sort of critical question to ask the students to reflect on, and see what comes out of that, and see how they feel about whether they are represented in these materials. And that can lead towards discussions regarding who else, what other types of identities are missing. So I mean, that's one aspect, is to really push it back on the students and have them try to analyze that material. But you know, another obviously is to simply add in your own material, you know, so things that happen in the news. I mean, it depends on the age group, of course. I certainly am not talking about young learners, young learners, because I don't have a lot of familiarity with that context. So I would be speaking more around, you know, the teenage and up group for my own expertise. But in those cases, we can have students source materials themselves from the internet. We can bring in our own examples of LGBTQ characters and narratives. And there's various ways that you can approach that too, which I'm sure we'll talk about later as well. But those are primarily the two ways, I think, is have the students question the material itself and bring in your own material that is on topic, but it includes more variety.
That's great. Thank you. Yes, indeed, we are trying to do that, and we are trying to help teachers do that, right, with the interviews and the material we upload to our social media accounts. So thank you. In your blog and in conferences as well, right, you talk about the normalizing approach, and you describe the normalizing approach as one soft yet effective mode for creating inclusive materials. Can you explain, can you tell us what the normalizing approach is about? And well, maybe we can share a wonderful unit you created, right? Which is focused from, which is framed within the normalizing approach, right? So the teachers can have a look at that unit.
Sure. So the very first thing I'm going to say is that I, like you or like anyone, are on a learning curve myself, right? And so nothing is definite, and nothing's static, everything is dynamic, and it changes. And so there has been some criticism, to be honest, about the word normalization, and I want to start with that. The reason I want to start with that is because when I wrote this coursebook unit, or when I started talking about these things, normalization was definitely a term that was used quite frequently. And the biggest criticism, I think, is around the word normal, insofar as normal is an attribute to work towards, and that is the one that you want to be. And so by using normalization, it then sets up the idea that something is abnormal, and we want to move that abnormalness to being more normal. And so that isn't always the way that we want to frame LGBTQ or any marginalized group to become more normal. However, having said that, perhaps a more useful term now is usual, right? And so some people have been reframing what I'm going to talk about as usualization. And so what I mean by this, in either term really, is to increase the representation, frankly, in the materials, to make not the default majority the most common and the only type of narrative that is used in materials. So increase the frequency of different groups of people, not just straight white people, rich, for example, and have a more diverse array of individuals. So I think the key concept here is to increase with frequency the number of different types of individuals, including queer, but also racialized groups, and to make them individuals. So there's not just one version, right? Because one of the problems with course books that I've mentioned before is you have so few queer people, as an example, that you really only tend to have one type. And that one type becomes the sort of stereotype or the representative of that entire group. And of course, we're all individuals, no matter which group we belong to, whether you're straight white or whether you're black queer. You have an individual personality and you have an individual characteristics. And so we want to have those two things represented with some frequency. And then the third aspect of normalization, or usualization, I guess we'll change it to, is to not actually focus on the LGBTQ-ness of the characters, but actually they're just a matter-of-fact part of the unit, a matter-of-fact part of society. And so we're not using this unit to teach specifically queer vocabulary or queer lifestyles or whatever you want to call it. We're using them and us and everybody just as the narrative to teach the language that happens to be in that unit. So what you're showing right now as an example is a unit that I created, which was focused on compare and contrast language in particular, right? And so just like any coursebook unit, you would have that type of unit. And so I created the topic or the theme of the unit to be work-life balance, because I thought, well, that's a good space where you need to compare things and you need to contrast. And so I thought that would provide good content for that language. And in addition, my main goal was to show what an inclusive coursebook unit would look like, where we have a usualization approach, where we have more LGBTQ characters, as well as different types of characters throughout. I mean, you can see there's different Asian ethnicities that are included. There are different age groups that are included. There are different ability groups that are included, and none are represented in a way that is the most stereotypical, in my opinion. And so throughout the whole unit, you can see language appearing that is related to queer culture. For example, in one of the earlier pages where there's a listening involved. Yes, this one. Whoops, that's okay. We have different pairs of people, and one of the pairs is a non-binary, a person with their mother. Another pair are a lesbian couple, right? Another one is a sort of androgynous man. We don't know necessarily how his sexuality is, but those are just backgrounds. And then in the listening itself, we can hear the mother of the non-binary person, for example, refer to their child as they throughout. But the attention isn't drawn to that specifically. The attention is really just to the language task itself. And the characters and the narratives that are included are just there, you know, just like any characters or narratives would be. And so that was the approach, the normalizing approach that I wanted to show off in an actual course book, because it really hasn't been done, frankly.
Oh, sorry, I couldn't unmute myself. Okay, thank you. That was very interesting. We really wanted to share that that unit, sample unit you had created. It's really interesting. Okay. Well, you did mention something about representing people as individuals, okay, and somehow not use a person to represent the whole community. How can we find a balance there to include the LGBTQ community, yes, but not just one version, okay, of the LGBTQ community as representative of the whole? Right.
Well, I mean, one way to ensure you have opportunity to do that is to, like I said, increase the frequency of queer characters, basically, right? If you only have one in an entire set of lessons, you're sort of by default choosing the one representative that you are going to focus on, and that becomes tricky, right? So obviously increasing the number and the frequency of queer characters is the first way to go about that. But then I've had questions from writers or teachers who are not, who don't identify as LGBTQ themselves, and wonder how can we write or include a fair representation. And so I think it comes down really to learning and research. You know, like if you were writing a unit or materials about vegetarianism, for example, you wouldn't just simply create that out of your own head. You would look for research about vegetarianism, and you would learn as much as you can to make you feel comfortable writing materials that include vegetarianism. And so the same thing kind of goes with identity, you know, and representation. So if you don't have many queer friends, or you don't know any transgender people, and you want to include any of us, you know, appropriately, it just behooves you to actually read more personal accounts from a wider variety of LGBTQ people, as well as watch YouTube videos. You know, there's a plethora of different people's perspectives available in the world, and it's just a matter of taking the time to investigate those things. And so, you know, I think all materials writers in general, as well as teachers, want to bring in authentic materials, you know, something that is sort of real. But at the same time, the way to do that with persona or identities is to also take a look at news articles that happen with regards to queer people, or YouTube videos where, you know, transgender people are actually talking about their lives, and use those as inspiration, at least to learn and to bring in those types of identities and represent them. As you might see in that course book unit, I myself am not a drag queen, and I don't know any drag queens personally. However, I've been to drag shows, and I have also, well, that's probably my main extent with drag queens, exactly. But I wanted to include some drag queen, because that's part of queer culture. And so I found articles online and some events on Facebook, actually, where drag queens were reading stories to children at local libraries. And that's a real thing that happens around here, at least. And so I used that as inspiration to bring that into the Candy Cream narrative, the Tyler and Candy Cream narrative that I used in the course book. And so it's not exactly that, you know, I'm not plagiarizing, you know, because it wasn't just lifted exactly, but I used it to create a compare contrast situation where Tyler himself doesn't feel very outgoing and is afraid to speak in public, but when he's in drag as Candy Cream, he feels much less shy, and he brings on his own persona. And so it brought in that language, but it also brought it in a way that was authentic and something that was actually true. So, yeah.
Okay, yeah, it all comes down to learning. That's
Yeah.
it. That's the secret.
Totally.
Really.
You know, there's no shortcut, really.
Not at all. Okay, so in your experience, right, what are the most common obstacles when it comes to LGBTQ plus inclusivity at school, right?
Well, I would say, you know, the main obstacle would come down to the support of the institution, first of all, or the government, or the country's context. You know, every country is somewhat different, and I can't obviously speak for all countries in the world. So that might be the first barrier. But all things aside, let's say that you know, is not punishable criminally. The bigger barrier I find comes down to teachers themselves, and the teacher's comfort level, and the teacher's insecurity with actually bringing in materials, because a lot of teachers do seem to want to be inclusive. I mean, that's our profession, right? We want to teach everyone, and we want to not discriminate our ability to teach everyone and to help them learn in a learning environment. So by default, I think teachers want to be inclusive. And as inclusivity and diversity, and whatever words you want to call, have become buzzwords in ELT lately, more and more people have shown interest and realize that there's gaps in the content that they're using. But there's a fear that's attached as well to, you know, make a mistake or do something wrong or say something wrong or say something offensive. And, you know, I myself continue to have that fear to some degree, you know, like as I noted, you know, when I started this several years ago, normalization was the term that was more commonly used, and that has been criticized the further things have been going on. So I think we all just have to accept that we're going to make some mistakes, and we are on a learning path ourselves, and we need to do our best and just try. And so, as I said, connected to the last situation, we need to really just do our own research and become more and more familiar, and don't wait for someone to teach us how to do everything. because that's just not going to happen everywhere in the world, you know. And so you may make mistakes, and that's probably going to happen. But the more you learn about how to do something inclusively, the more you realize from your mistake, okay, I did this wrong last time, let's try something different next time. So that seems to be the bigger barriers, in my opinion.
Yeah, the same happens here. Teachers do want to be more inclusive, but they are afraid. Mm-hmm. They are afraid of families complaining about something, okay, or the head of the school, even though we have this law, the CSE law, which makes it compulsory, okay, to deal with and to bring diversity into the classroom. Well, diversity is in the classroom, right? Diversity is there, but representing diversity in our materials and our classes, teachers still, some of them are afraid. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I didn't even talk about the fact that some people may be afraid to lose their jobs in this situation. You know, like that's a whole other level that I'm not equipped to give great advice to. But at the same time, we all need to really accept that there is a wider variety of people out there than we are catering to. And those people include our learners. You know, our learners identify as LGBTQ as well. Even if you don't think they do, they do. And they come from poor backgrounds. They come from marginalized, racialized groups, even though maybe it doesn't appear that way. And so, you know, we need to accept that as a profession, and we need to cater to that situation and not just, you know, assume our learners are all straight, light-skinned, affluent, you know, types of learners, because they're just simply not. And by not addressing that with more inclusive materials, we're really harming the identities of those learners themselves. You know, as if you sort of go full circle in terms of where the teacher identity thing started from in this conversation. You know, when I grew up, there were no gay people that were role models in any kind of media, really, none. And the way in which gay people were portrayed, or at least talked about, was very negative. And so the way I grew up was that thinking, okay, well, I'm very strange and I need to hide who I am, and I need to try to pretend to be someone I'm not in order to fit into society. And so that same thing is still happening now with our learners.
Yes, indeed. So it's necessary that we take this intersectional point of view as well, right? To include the different struggles of our students, okay?
Totally.
Okay, we move on to the next question that has to do with language, the teaching of the language itself. We read that you speak about LGBTQ+ language as target language in some of your blog posts, and you also mentioned it a few minutes ago, right? Can you tell us what you referred to with that term?
Well, I do think that there are certain terms that are queer-related terms, and one of those, just as an example, were pronouns, right? And so, I mean, obviously we all use pronouns, so I mean, I guess I can't strictly say it's a queer thing, but the fact that queer people can sometimes refer to themselves different than the traditional he and she, or ille and elle, or what have you, in whatever language we're talking about. That needs to be something that we need to familiarize our students with, because they're going to experience that with people that they're talking to, but also our students themselves may in fact use they and them as one example. And so that language, that example can come up just in the materials that you're writing, like I showed on the coursebook unit, right? It wasn't a pronouns lesson. It was just some pronouns that were used in that lesson. In that way, learners can either pass right by it, or they can actually look at it and go, I wonder why that was used that way. And then potentially ask questions to bring about a discussion. So that's one approach to the language. But on the flip side, there are other specific situations where, you know, if you don't know what LGBTQIA2 actually means, then you can more explicitly talk about that in in class, because, you know, that's going to be something learners see, you know, just like any word. Similarly, if you don't know whether a term is derogatory or whether it's, you know, okay to use, that might be something that needs to be explicitly taught as well, you know. So the way gay people refer to themselves may not be the way that every group of people can refer to gay people. You know, the same way, you know, Black people refer to themselves sometimes may not be the same way that white people can refer. And so that type of language as target language might be something that needs explicit teaching instead of inductive or deductive teaching sometimes too. So I guess that's kind of what I mean by LGBTQ as target language.
Okay, that's very interesting. Debates and discussions are a very common activity that teachers use, right, at the moment of dealing with topics that are considered to be controversial, right? Mm-hmm. However, with certain topics, these kind of activities can become dangerous. For example, we may, when we speak about rights, right, we may end up validating arguments against those rights. So our question is, what considerations do we teachers, right, need to have at the moment of organizing debates, for example, or discussion-like activities, and at the moment of guiding these kind of activities as well?
Well, that's, I mean, I think you've already nailed it on the head in one scenario. You know, discussing rights as a debate, I think, is obviously something that should be off the table. Because, I mean, it goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. You know, my own ability to live my life is not for you to decide, you know, and so I don't think that that should be something that's available as a debate topic. The other issue with debates are just the fact that you have a debate means that there are at least two sides that are arguable. And when you have two sides that are arguable, you are setting up the idea that both of those are valid arguments. And so you need to be considerate as to what you're debating and whether or not you actually want your learners to feel as though there are two valid sides to argue. And so, you know, should gay marriage be legalized or should it be okay is an example of, okay, well, if I tell you to argue against that and you to argue for it, you're setting up that those two are equally valid, right? Even if you don't intend for the no side to win, you know, you're still presenting it as though it's valid. And then another aspect is, you know, the teacher themselves, you know, we have a lot of power in the classroom, whether we like it or not. There's a dynamic that's set up there between teachers and students. And so whatever activity we bring and however we frame the activity to our students is how we're showing our attitudes towards that. And so we are not neutral participants in the classroom. Education is political in sort of default setting. And so when we bring in a debate, even if we don't take a side or we help both sides, the fact that we've brought in this debate topic shows that we believe it is debatable as teachers. And that is a model for how we think our learners should think as well, that we want our learners to think that this is debatable as well. And so those are kind of the considerations that you need to make. So debates are you know, a contentious type of activity. And while engaging, perhaps, you know, you don't want to ever force a group of students to take an opinion they don't have about someone's rights, for example, and argue to support that opinion. You know, just imagine, I think, if you have a bisexual student in your group and you're asking that you didn't know, and you're asking that bisexual to argue against LGBTQ rights for the sake of debate. You know, how ridiculous is that I would be forced to argue against my own rights, for example. And then finally, you know, the last thing I'll say about this debate situation is when you're talking about a group of people, even if there are none in your classroom, for example, like queer people, when you're bringing in that scenario where you're talking about what to do with a particular group of people, or whether they're good or bad or what have you, you're doing it without actually the representation of those people in that discussion. And so that's problematic too. So if I were talking about even something that's not queer related, but something like, you know, elderly people, and I wanted to figure out what should we put elderly people in nursing homes, or should they live in someone's life? We need to bring in actual LGBT, or sorry, not so used to talking about LGBT, elderly. We need to bring in elderly perspectives, you know, bring in some content that shows how elderly people feel about nursing homes and so on, and how they feel about being there and what have you. And I think this sort of stems from an Indigenous, and by Indigenous in Canada, I mean First Nations people and Métis, people who lived on this land before Europeans got here. There's a phrase that's quite commonly used, which is not about us, without us. And what that suggests is don't talk about us when we're not present. Don't discuss our issues and make decisions about us when we're not there and we don't have a voice in that scenario. And so that's a good sort of maxim to live by, I think, in your own materials and activities too.
Okay, thank you for sharing that with us, because we are often asked what we think about debates and this kind of activities, and definitely we agree with what you say. We cannot discuss someone else's identity, someone else's rights, especially when there are laws, okay?
Yeah, I know.
I mean, it's a law.
I know. When the legalization of same-sex marriage happened in Canada in 2004, you know, that was the end of that debate. You know, like there was, you know, not that I really enjoyed debating it before that, but it was a done deal at that point. You know, you can't really talk about it anymore. I totally get what you're saying, and you know, debate whether minimum wage should be increased. You know, for example, you know.
Well, it should be, so we shouldn't be debating it at all.
Well, I guess
we should be finding
ways.
Right. We should be finding ways, definitely.
How should minimum wage be increased in order to, you know, be sustainable? What have you? You know.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. Yes, but not whether it should be or not raised. Yeah, definitely. Yes, and well, here in Argentina we have the same-sex marriage law and gender identity law, but still people are debating whether that should be like that or not. Okay. Yeah. It's terrible. Especially when there are children involved at school. Okay, that's terrible. That's terrible.
Totally.
Sorry,
I mean, you're setting up. No. I'm interrupting you. We're setting up, you know, children's feelings about different groups of people. If in fact we're asking children to participate in these types of debates, I mean, that's ridiculous. But no, what I was going to say was, I think that debates generally seem engaging. And one of the reasons why some teachers have asked me why they can't discuss gay marriage as a debate, or maybe just in general even, because the students want to, or are sometimes coming from countries where it is not a law. And I try to say, well, I don't think you need to avoid LGBTQ topics. Obviously, I don't think that, because we need to bring those into the forefront and through the different approaches I'm talking about. But you don't have to argue about gay marriage. Like, that doesn't have to be the one way in which you allow students to have questions and discuss something they're you know, potentially unfamiliar with in their context. So there's other ways.
Definitely, yes. Okay, to round off this conversation, this is a question we ask most of our guest speakers. How can everything that we have discussed today contribute to social justice?
Well, I mean, pretty much by default, everything that we're discussing is social justice, don't you think? You know, so I mean, it sort of answers itself in a certain way. But if we think of education and the purpose of education itself, I mean, we're all educators. This is the identity aspect that I'm referring to. You know, we're not just language technicians. We are educators, and we're part of the education profession. If we think about education itself, the purpose of it is to improve the lives of the people in it, right? That is the underlying sort of basic reason why people are educated and take education and so on. So in order to do that, no matter whether it's primarily because a student is trying to learn law in order to become a lawyer or what have you, we need to make sure that all learners and teachers, frankly, are comfortable and safe and are able to actually do the learning that they need to do in order to get from point A to point B for whatever purpose or goals they have. And if we ignore social justice topics, and by that I really just mean topics that should be commonplace and should be fair and equal for everyone. If we ignore that aspect of education, then we're really not enabling our learners to actually thrive in education itself, and we're just ignoring a key fundamental part of being an educator. So you can't be an educator and be neutral. It's just not a possibility. So if you take an absentee side, you're really siding with the status quo and the way things always are. So that is a choice that you're making. Yeah. So really, that's I think ultimately the bottom line. Everything is social justice.
Yeah, everything is social justice, and neutrality doesn't exist, really.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your time and for everything that you have shared with us. Thank you, really. Thank you.
It's been a privilege to talk to you. Thank you.
Oh, the privilege is ours. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good.